Mark stuff makes a lot more sense than Roger, in full denim walking through, the desert. But also, can we just talk about how much Adam looks like an early '90s Bon Jovi with that feathered hair?
Okay,
I've
on
never
the
noticed that
commentary
before.
track, they make fun of him on the commentary track for that. So
as they should.
They're aware of it. They're fully aware of that.
Yeah, you know what's really interesting, and I went back and watched the last Broadway performance that they filmed and released, and where Will Chase plays Roger. And what's super interesting is, one, both Will Chase and Adam Pascal have played Shakespeare in Something Rotten, which is a musical completely unrelated to Rent. But what's interesting about it is that in the Broadway version, during this song, Roger has like guy liner and he looks super, it's just such a very different presentation of the character than what they went for on film. Coincidentally enough, Shakespeare in Something Rotten also wears a ton of guy liner and is actually dressed quite a bit like Roger from the stage version, but that's neither here nor there. But anyway, yeah, I mean, the arc of what Mark goes through during those 2 months in which this song takes place is about him getting increasingly frustrated with his job at Buzzline and continuing to film things for his movie and piece it together. What I think doesn't happen in the film version that I think is done really well on stage is we don't have the opening where Mark does the narration for some of his packages for Buzzline, which I don't understand because he's a director, not on air, but whatever, that doesn't matter. There's so many plot holes in Rent, it doesn't, just suspend the disbelief, because he does the whole vampire welfare queen
I have that right in front of me.
Yeah, and
I am Mark Cohen here from Buzzline. Back to you, Alexi. Coming up next, vampire welfare queens who are compulsive bowlers.
Yeah, like that's funny. It's a joke. I also don't understand why he throws it back to Alexi and then goes on. That's not how TV works. But again, I digress. But we don't get to understand how frustrating his job is during this scene. But I've also, this is at the core of this song and not the film itself. And it might go back to La Boheme. I don't know the opera well at all. But is he incapable of doing a job and working on his film? Because I know a ton of people who do their art in addition to a day job. So I don't really understand why he had to quit Buzzline. I mean, if he found it that morally repugnant, okay, I get that. But he says he quits because he has to finish his own film. I guess he can't do both at the same time. I don't know.
But then also, as a podcaster who has a full-time job.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. I have a full-time job, and then I do a daily podcast every night. So I understand you can do both. But I another thing, I find it's an interesting choice by Mark in the film to tell Alexi. He addresses Alexi directly and quits just by screaming off the roof of his building. He doesn't call her. He just says, "Alexi, I quit."
I have a thought
from the top of
that,
his building.
I have a thought.
It's a little weird.
Okay, well, I have
it's
a thought.
Weird.
Is
okay,
he
go
actually
ahead.
quitting, or is it one of those things where you want to quit, so you're venting your frustrations, but you're not actually going to quit?
That's an interesting choice. On stage, he uses a payphone and calls it Alexi. Yes. So if they are inferring that he does not actually quit, that is not very well established in the film version. It would make more sense, but again, another one of those things that I guess they didn't want to do another cutaway because it's towards the end of the song. Just lots and lots of questions.
Well, I think that also, remember in the movie, he actually pays Benny for rent, so he's now paying Benny, so he kind of needs the money. So,
yeah, and there's a whole discussion about Benny, where it's so interesting that he is framed as the bad guy, and he's obviously a bit of a douchebag. But is he really a bad guy?
We had this discussion a couple episodes ago with a guest. We relate to Benny more as adults.
Yes. Well, and also totally the whole cheating on his wife thing that goes without saying. But that's really not why he's the bad guy in the show. They don't really seem to care about this in the show. The show frames him as the bad guy because he wants to make an arts company and take an abandoned lot and turn it into a building.
He wants to make their lives better.
Yes, like he literally tells them that if you stop our mutual friend from doing something that can hurt me personally, business-wise, I'll let you live here for free and work here for free. Like, that's not a bad guy. Now, granted, the whole peripheral stuff about, kind of just being a general jerk and cheating on his wife, that's great. But that's not really why Jonathan Larson says he's a bad guy.
Yeah. I feel like we just had this conversation a couple of shows ago. Same mentality. Benny is not the bad guy in this story. Yeah. I mean, at all.
Yeah, but whatever, it is what it is. And it's just, musical theater is an art form where you just kind of have to go with it because it's not a realistic medium. And that's why it's so hard in my opinion, for musicals to translate to movies. And that's why so many of them are so bad, especially the ones that are not naturalistic. Things like Nine, which is an incredibly artistic show on stage, translated to an absolutely horrific movie, because it's hard to take a show that is not told with a bunch of pop and circumstance. It doesn't have a ton of set changes, doesn't have a ton of literal things happening on stage, and make it work in a medium that is probably the most naturalistic medium that we have in art. Theater is probably, at least in performing arts, the least, and film is the one that is probably the most. So it is hard just to make sure that the feeling and the tone that I was talking about at the beginning that I don't think Christopher Columbus got, that's just hard to work for any movie musical. And the ones that tend to work are the ones that embrace it not being literal. Things like the Chicago film that approached that text as not being super literal. All of the songs are kind of these dream sequences. Now, that works with Chicago. Would not work with Rent, I don't think.
No.
Also something like Into the Woods. Not a great film, but a good film. But it's about magic, so of course it's
you get away with it.
What you want with that. But this is a story about real people in the real world, and it's just a hard thing to do to make it work. But my point, going back to Benny, is that you just kind of have to go with musicals. They're going to take you places and things aren't going to make sense, but you just go with it because you don't really have a choice.
I got a question for you, because the next big musical outside of like Mary Poppins and stuff like that is In the Heights. Are you worried about that transferring to film? Because I'm not. What do you think?
Actually, what's interesting is I was actually in my head thinking In the Heights when I was talking about the plot holes. There's a ton of plot holes in The Heights.
Oh yeah, there is.
just like a ton. Like timeline wise,
it's 3 days.
There's a lot of weird stuff. Yeah. Well, and then the whole water thing, and like how old is Nina? Well, yeah. How old is Nina? And how old is Navi and Benny? Again, another Benny.
Yeah.
But man, did Chris Jackson ever play Benny and Rent? I don't know. Anyway,
I don't know.
He played Simba. He was Simba on Broadway at one point. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. No, I'm not super worried about it because it is a story that I think naturalistically can work. I also think that audiences are going to give Lin-Manuel Miranda a lot of just credit. They're just going to be like, okay, I can get into this. I know what he does. And I also think that the music is so good and it feels much more current than maybe Rent did a decade later, when the movie came out. So I don't anticipate In the Heights being any problem. I mean, I'll also, of course, depends on who stars in it. I think the director, John Chu, who did Crazy Rich Asians, I think he is more than capable of handling this type of property. So I'm really excited for it. I think it's one of my favorite shows. This and Rent they're in my top 4 or 5 favorite musicals of all time. So I'm very excited to see what they do with it.
So one more question I have for you. As the Rent person, you were in New York recently. Jonathan Larson project. I didn't know much about it. I know you saw it. Don't tell people about the Jonathan Larson project.
Yeah, that's really the reason that I went up for just 2 days in mid-October, first week of October. The Jonathan Larson Project is a concert, and it's been announced that it's going to be turned into a cast album, and I would imagine that it'll end up being licensed. It was basically the brainchild of producer and Broadway historian Jennifer Ashley Tepper, who is the programming director at Feinstein's 54 Below, which they call the Broadway Supper Club. It's a cabaret venue. And she is also she is working as the historian / dramaturg on the film version of Tick, Tick, Boom, which is another Jonathan Larson musical that is actually being directed by Lin-Manuel Miranda. So there's that whole kind of synergy. But anyway, she was able to get access to all of Jonathan Larson's papers and recordings that are housed at the Library of Congress. And she went through them and found all these songs that have never really been heard before, maybe other than a few times that Jonathan played them for friends. And when he died in 95, 96, I can't remember exactly the year it was, they just kind of died with him. Tick, Tick, Boom was a one-person show that he did by himself that after his death, his family gave approval to a playwright to kind of mold it into a 3-ish person musical. But really, other than that, none of his works have been kind of presented to the public. So Jennifer Ashley Tepper worked with the Jonathan Larson family and was able to get permission to have these songs done. So they had an incredible cast of 5 musical theater actors and a different guest for every performance. And they did what essentially amounted to a song cycle where it told the story. I mean, I guess it really didn't tell a story, but it showed you a lot of the different times of color that Jonathan Larson had in his writing. Everything from, if you didn't know, he wrote a musical about 1984, not the year, the book. He wrote a lot of things that seem incredibly prescient to today. And it's just super interesting to see the types of different things that he had in him at that point that we didn't know about, but also incredibly sad to think about what he could have been doing. I mean, he wouldn't even have been, if he would have been just around, late 50s, early 60s by now. And to think that he died 22 years ago or 23 years ago, and to think that he had all of that music in him still that he could have given to the world is really heartbreaking, especially for someone like me who grew up on Rent and loves Tick, Tick, Boom. I'm very excited that it's going to be preserved and the cast album is going to come out, but it was a great experience. I went to the very first performance. It was fantastic, but for people who love Jonathan Larson and Rent and Tick, Tick, Boom, this is something that you will very much want to see. I didn't know what to expect, and it still blew my mind and defied all expectations.
That's good to know. I saw you posting about it, and I saw it all over social media, but I didn't know much about it, so very cool.
Yeah, and I'd actually gotten the chance to, for something completely unrelated, I interviewed Daphne Rubin Vega, who was the original Mimi in Rent on Broadway and got replaced by Rosario Dawson for the film a week before. Like, I was talking to her about a cast album that she was on that was getting released, but I talked to her about it, and she said, like, what's so interesting about the songs that were used in the Jonathan Larson Project is, like, she said, this is Jonathan. Like, this is, to hear him this way, like, this is the stuff that we know him as. This is who we knew him as. And yes, everybody knows the Rent stuff, and that's kind of become its own thing. But to hear these songs, for even her, in a lot of cases, for the first time, it's like being able to hear him perform it, or to have a conversation with him. And so it was a very important thing. She was one of the special guests that performed once or twice.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and so a very, very cool thing for even her, who's been a part of the Jonathan Larson legacy for 2+ decades now.
Oh, very, very cool. Well, Matt, thank you for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
it's nice to hear the other perspective, because we're always so positive. What's actually, no, it's not a bad thing. I actually wanted that perspective. I say that over on Clerks Minute a lot. Not everybody likes the movie, so to have the opposite perspective.
No, and like I told you when you originally asked me, it's like, I don't really like it. So as long as you're okay with that, we'll be good. And like I said, I love Rent, so I am very appreciative of the fact that it has been preserved in this way. However, if you have access to, I guess this is on Netflix, but if you have access to streaming, I would recommend the filmed version of the last week of Broadway performances instead. But that's just me being, a theater originalist, and I just enjoy the theater side of things more.
I just had one more